They called us slaves. We reduced their armies to ashes. Part 1. The Collar and the Chain. The tunnel smelled like iron and burnt rock. It always did. Cole Hargrove had stopped noticing the smell around year 10. Now, in his 31st year underground, the smell was just part of breathing. He dragged a loaded ore cart along the rail track, his boots scraping against the stone floor. His back bent at the angle it always bent at the end of a long shift. Around him, other humans worked in silence. Nobody talked much down here. Talking cost energy, and energy was something none of them had to spare. The lights in the tunnel were dull yellow, Vorkai lights, designed for Vorkai eyes, which were sharper than human eyes and did not need much brightness. The humans had learned to work in the dim glow. They had learned to do a lot of things they were never meant to do. He was lean and wiry, with short brown hair that was going gray at the sides, and hands that were so calloused they barely felt pain anymore. His face had the kind of stillness that comes from years of keeping every thought behind a wall. He looked like a man who had accepted his life. He was not that man. He had never been that man. But looking like it had kept him alive for 3 decades, and alive was the only position from which a person could do anything useful. Above them, far above, beyond hundreds of meters of rock and processed stone, was the Vorkai colonial city of Veth Sora. It sat on the surface of Mars like a wound. Great towers of pale gray metal, wide landing platforms where Vorkai military ships came and went daily, markets and government halls and barracks full of soldiers who had never once considered that the ground beneath their city might be full of people who were paying very close attention. Humanity had been paying attention for 200 years. The Vorkai arrived at Earth on a Tuesday morning. Cole knew this not because he had been alive at the time, he had not, but because it was one of the first things passed down in the archive. A Tuesday morning, and 72 hours later, it was done. The Vorkai fleet was not the largest in the Dominion, but it was more than enough. Earth's defense systems, which had been built to handle threats from within the solar system, had no answer for something that dropped out of deep space, already firing. The governments of Earth sent surrender signals within the first 12 hours. The fighting that continued after that was unorganized, desperate, and brave. And it did not change the outcome. Humanity became a labor resource. That was the official Vorkai classification. Not an enemy species, not a conquered people, not even a subject population in the way the Vorkai used that word. A labor resource. Like ore was a mineral resource, like water was a liquid resource. The Vorkai had a talent for administration, and their administration of humanity was thorough and cold and completely without malice, which somehow made it worse. They did not hate humans. They did not think about humans at all, in the same way a person does not think about the chair they are sitting on. Cole's overseer was a Vorkai named Da Voss. He was tall, gray-skinned, with 4 long fingers on each hand, and eyes the color of old copper. He walked the tunnel every few hours, with his hands behind his back, watching the humans work. He had a speech he gave to new arrivals. Cole had heard it so many times, he could recite it word for word. It was about the original invasion, about how the humans had begged, about how the Dominion had shown mercy by choosing labor over extermination. It was meant to make the humans feel grateful. Mostly, it made them feel something else entirely, something they were very careful never to show on their faces. Cole emptied his cart at the processing end of the tunnel, and turned back for another load. As he passed a narrow side passage, one of the old ventilation shafts that the Vorkai engineers had sealed off years ago and forgotten about, a hand reached out and touched his arm. He did not react. He did not look. He just slowed his walk by half a step. A young woman fell into step beside him. She was new. He had seen her assigned to the tunnels 3 days ago. 19 years old, maybe 20. Dark hair pulled back. A smear of rock dust across her left cheek. Eyes that were too alert for someone who was pretending to be exhausted. Her name was Nora Vance, and she had come from the surface processing camps on the other side of Vetsora. She did not look at Cole either. She looked straight ahead, the same as him. In her closed fist, barely visible between her fingers, she held a small flat stone. On its surface, scratched in a pattern that looked like nothing more than random marks from tunnel work, was a symbol. It was not a letter from any human alphabet. It was older than that. A symbol that had been invented specifically for this purpose, in a basement on what was left of Denver, about 160 years ago. Cole recognized it the way he would recognize his own heartbeat. He took the stone from her hand as they walked, closing his fingers around it without breaking his stride. He held it for 3 seconds, feeling the shape of the scratched lines, making sure he had read it right. Then he dropped it quietly into a floor drain they passed over. Evidence was something you got rid of. The symbol meant one thing. It had always meant one thing. Cole had been told about it as a child by his father, who had been told about it by his mother, who had received it from the generation before her. It was the signal that the network had agreed on 2 centuries ago, back when the first generation of archive keepers decided that someday, if the conditions were ever right, they would send a word across every human cell on every Vorkai world. The word was simple. One concept. No room for misunderstanding. Begin. Cole walked back to his ore pile. He picked up his shovel. He began loading the cart again, same as always, back bent at the same angle, face carrying the same expression of a man who had accepted his life. Davos walked past at the far end of the tunnel, glanced at the workers, and kept moving. He did not notice anything different. He would not notice anything different for a while yet. That was the point. Cole worked through the rest of his shift in silence, the same as every other day. But something had changed in the quality of his silence. It was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of a thing already in motion. Quiet, not because it was still, but because it had not yet arrived. Somewhere above him, through hundreds of meters of rock and steel and Vorkai certainty, the city of Vetsora hummed along without interruption. Ships landed and lifted off. Soldiers ran their drills. Administrators filed their reports. The Dominion continued to function exactly as it always had. It had no idea what was living underneath it. They called us slaves. We reduced their armies to ashes. The signal had gone out, and across 14 worlds, people who had been waiting their entire lives finally stopped waiting. Nobody announced it. Nobody held a meeting. There were no speeches, no flags, no dramatic moments in firelit rooms. The network did not work that way. It had never worked that way. The people who built it 2 centuries ago understood something very clearly, that the Vorkai were watching everything visible, so everything real had to be invisible. The signal moved the way water moves through rock, slowly, quietly, and completely unstoppable once it had found its path. On a frozen mining colony orbiting a gas giant in the outer edge of the Dominion, a woman named Dana Holm received the signal on a Tuesday. She was 54 years old, short and heavy-set, with white hair cropped close to her head, and a face that had been weathered by decades of cold air, recycled through aging filtration systems. She was sitting in the colony's maintenance bay, running a diagnostic on a broken heating coil, when the message arrived through a channel so old and low frequency that the Vorkai comm scanners had stopped monitoring it 80 years ago. The message was 3 seconds long. It contained a single tone pattern. Dana set down her tools. She sat still for a moment. Then she picked the tools back up and finished the diagnostic, because the heating coil still needed fixing, and there was no point letting people freeze while history was being made. That evening, she called a quiet gathering of 43 people in a storage room behind the colony's fuel depot. They stood close together in the cold, their breath visible in the air. Dana did not give a speech. She simply told them that the time they had been told about since childhood had arrived, and that everyone needed to begin doing exactly what they had spent years preparing to do. There were no questions. Everyone already knew their role. That was the whole point of the archive, not to tell people what to do at the last moment, but to make sure they had known for years. 3 star systems away, in the upper residential district of a Vorkai naval station that housed the Dominion's largest fleet command center, a woman named Lena Carr was setting a table for dinner. She worked as a domestic servant in the household of a Vorkai fleet admiral named Go Reth, a broad, humorless creature who had commanded more ships than most humans had ever seen. Lena had worked in his household for 11 years. She was 38, quiet, and exceptionally good at her job. Admiral Go Reth considered her one of his better-managed possessions. He had never once learned her last name. In 11 years, Lena had memorized every corridor of the naval station, every guard rotation, every shift change, every door that locked from the inside, and every door that did not. She had memorized the encryption sequences on the Admiral's private communication terminal by watching his fingers over thousands of meals, thousands of small moments when powerful people forget that the person carrying their food has eyes. She had never written any of it down. It lived entirely in her head, organized with a precision that would have impressed people who built machines for a living. She placed the Admiral's dinner on the table. He did not look up from his reports. She returned to the kitchen and stood at the counter, and for just a moment, when no one was watching, she closed her eyes and smiled. Not a big smile, small and private and a long time coming. On a Vorkai military hospital ship that ran regular routes between 3 occupied worlds, a man named Owen Briggs was finishing his shift in the medical ward. Owen was 41, with a calm and careful way of moving that came from years of working around patients. He had trained as a doctor before the colony he grew up on was swept into Vorkai control. Now he worked as a medical orderly, which the Vorkai considered a reasonable use of human skills. They let their human medical staff treat wounded Vorkai soldiers, because it saved them the cost of deploying more of their own medical personnel. This was a significant miscalculation. Owen had spent a decade studying Vorkai biology with the focused intensity of someone who had a very specific reason for wanting to understand it completely. He knew their respiratory system and how it processed atmospheric compounds. He knew their neurological structure and which chemical interactions disrupted it. He knew the 3 places on a Vorkai body where blunt force caused disproportionate damage, and the 2 specific compounds that their immune systems could not process without severe reaction. He had documented all of it in the archive, stored in memory, shared in careful whispers with the other human medics in the network. He had never used any of it. He had simply learned it, the way a person learns the location of every exit in a building they spend a lot of time in. Owen washed his hands, hung up his coat, and walked to the small quarters he shared with 2 other human workers. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed and stared at the floor for a little while. He thought about his mother, who had told him about the archive when he was 7 years old. He thought about what she had said, that the knowledge was not there so they could destroy things, but so they could end the thing that was destroying them. There was a difference, she had told him, and it mattered. He believed her. He still did. Back in the tunnels under Vethsora, Cole had spent the 3 days since receiving the signal doing nothing that looked different from any other 3 days. He worked his shift. He ate his ration meals. He slept in his bunk in the workers' housing block. But inside the stillness of his routine, things were moving. He was mentally walking through every system he had memorized over 3 decades in these tunnels. The power junctions, the coolant routing, the support column structures that held the Vorkai city above them in place. He was not thinking about how they worked. He was thinking about how they stopped working. The Vorkai had built their city on top of human labor. They had let humans wire it and plumb it and dig the foundations for it, because human hands were cheap and replaceable. They had watched humans build it from the ground up and had never once considered that humans might also know exactly how to take it apart. That was the thing about being treated like furniture. People stopped watching what you did with your hands. Nora Vance found Cole again near the end of his shift, in the same narrow ventilation passage as before. She did not hand him anything this time. She just fell into step beside him and spoke in a voice so low it was almost breath. She said that the cells in the Eastern Processing Sector were ready. She said that the contacts in the Vorkai Water Reclamation Unit had confirmed the access points. She said that everyone was waiting on him. Cole nodded once, barely a movement at all. He told her they would move in 30 days. 30 days to make sure every thread of the network was in place. 30 days to make sure there would be no second attempt needed, because there would be no opportunity for one. Nora nodded and peeled away from his path without another word, and Cole continued down the tunnel with his cart, head slightly down, face showing nothing. Above him, Vetsora glittered in the Martian night. Its towers were lit up. Its ships were docked. Its soldiers were sleeping in warm barracks, completely at ease. They had no reason to think otherwise. They called us slaves. We reduced their armies to ashes. The 30 days passed the way all the other days had passed, quietly, without ceremony, without anything on the surface that looked like preparation. The humans went to work. They moved their carts. They fixed the machines. They served the meals. They changed the bandages. They did every small, invisible thing that kept the Vorkai world running, the same as always. And in the spaces between those things, in the spare seconds and the turned backs and the unwatched corners, they finished getting ready. On the morning of the 30th day, Cole woke up before his shift alarm. He lay still in his bunk for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling of the workers' housing block. Around him, other men were still sleeping. He listened to the sound of their breathing, and thought about the fact that by the end of this day, everything would be different. Either things would break open the way they were supposed to, or they would break in the other direction entirely. He had made peace with both possibilities a long time ago. That was the only way to do something like this, with a clear head. He got up, washed his face, and went to work. The first thing that happened was not an explosion. It was not a fight. It was a sound, or rather, the absence of one. At exactly the 3rd hour of the morning shift, 6 Vorkai shipyards across 4 different worlds went silent. The massive industrial hum of their power grids, which had run without interruption for decades, simply stopped. No warning, no alarm triggered beforehand. The gravity plating in the construction bays failed. The coolant systems that kept the ship reactors at safe temperatures shut down in a quiet, orderly sequence. The navigation calibration cores, which took weeks to reset once interrupted, went dark all at once. The Vorkai engineers on duty ran to their stations. They pulled up their diagnostic screens. They found no bombs, no breaches, no external interference of any kind. The systems had not been attacked. They had simply been turned off, from the inside, by people who had spent years learning exactly which switches to touch and in what order. The humans working those stations stood at their posts and looked confused and frightened, which was not difficult, because some of them genuinely were. Not all of the network's members were veterans of 30 years of careful planning. Some of them were young and scared, and running on belief and the weight of everything their parents had told them. But they held. Every one of them held. The Dominion High Command received the malfunction reports within the hour. A senior logistics officer reviewed them, noted the unusual coincidence of timing across multiple sites, and filed an urgent review request. The review was assigned a priority classification 2 levels below emergency. It was placed in a queue. It was still sitting in that queue when everything else started. Cole moved through the tunnels beneath Vethsora, with 10 other people behind him. They were not running. Running attracted attention. They walked at a steady pace, carrying equipment that looked like standard maintenance gear, which it mostly was. The components that made it into something else had been assembled over the course of 11 years, one small piece at a time. Each piece innocent on its own, none of them ever stored in the same place. Cole had held the complete design in his memory for so long that it felt like part of his own skeleton. They reached the primary power junction for the Eastern Administrative Grid at the 20-minute mark. Cole set down his bag and went to work. He did not rush. Rushing caused mistakes, and there was no room for even one mistake. He moved through the junction with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this sequence 10,000 times in his mind, because he had. The others formed a loose perimeter around him, watching the corridor approaches, their faces steady. 8 minutes later, Cole closed the last connection and stood up. The Eastern Administrative Grid of Vethsora went down like a tree falling. Communications across the entire Upper City District cut out simultaneously. The magrail network connecting the surface garrison to the underground armory froze in place. The environmental control systems for the Vorkai residential towers switched to backup power, which was sufficient for lighting, but not for the atmospheric processors that kept Vorkai air at the precise temperature and humidity their biology required. It was deeply uncomfortable, and a Vorkai soldier who was uncomfortable was a Vorkai soldier whose attention was on the wrong thing. On the hospital frigate, 3 systems away, Owen Briggs was doing something much quieter. He walked into the atmospheric processing room of the ship, carrying a standard maintenance kit, nodded to the single Vorkai technician on duty, and waited until the technician left the room to answer a comm call. Then Owen opened his kit, removed a small sealed container, and introduced its contents into the atmospheric feed that supplied the 3 military base sections of the ship. He was back in the medical ward, washing his hands, before the technician returned. The compound was not lethal. Owen would not have used it if it were. But within 40 minutes, every Vorkai soldier in those 3 base sections was experiencing what Owen clinically described as acute neurological disruption, which meant they were dizzy, disoriented, seeing things that were not there, and completely unable to coordinate any kind of organized response to anything. The effect lasted 6 hours. 6 hours was more than enough. Lena Carr waited until Admiral Goreth left his private office to attend the emergency briefing that had been called in response to the shipyard failures. The moment his footsteps faded down the corridor, she sat down at his communication terminal, entered the encryption sequence she had memorized 2 years ago, and sent out a fleet recall order under his personal command authorization. 2 full Vorkai battle groups, currently stationed at the exact positions that would allow them to respond most effectively to the unfolding situation, received orders to pull back to a distant staging point for what the message described as an urgent strategic repositioning. Neither battle group questioned the order. It came from a fleet admiral's terminal, with full encryption verification. They began moving within the hour. Lena stood up, straightened the chair, and walked back to the kitchen to prepare the admiral's evening meal, which he would never sit down to eat. Dana Holmes' broadcast went out at the 6th hour of the operation, from a transmitter built inside the frozen walls of the colony's outer maintenance shaft. Her voice was calm and unhurried. She spoke in standard Vorkai, which she had spent 15 years learning to speak without an accent. She addressed the Dominion High Command directly, and told them, without any anger or decoration, that the human workforce across all Vorkai-occupied worlds had ceased operations and would not be resuming them. She told them that any military response would be met with the application of 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge about Vorkai systems and vulnerabilities. She gave them 48 hours to choose between negotiating a boundary or beginning a war. Then she turned off the transmitter and went to help the others reinforce the colony's outer doors. In the silence after the broadcast, somewhere in the Dominion High Chamber, a senior military official stared at the communication log and said nothing for a very long time. Then he turned to the officers beside him and told them to prepare a full suppression fleet. He chose war. Across 14 worlds, the humans received the news and did not flinch. They had been counting on exactly that. They called us slaves. We reduced their armies to ashes. The Vorkai did not take long to respond. They never did. That was one thing you had to give them. They were fast when they were angry. And right now, they were very angry. 40 warships dropped into the Mars system within 18 hours of Dana Holmes' broadcast. They came in tight formation, the way the Vorkai always moved when they wanted to make a point about how large they were and how small everything else was. Their guns were already charged when they arrived. They did not send a greeting. They sent a targeting declaration, which was the Vorkai version of knocking on a door, except the door was a planet and the knock was a warning that the next thing coming would not be words. Ground forces landed on the surface of Mars within the hour. Heavy soldiers in sealed armor, carrying weapons that could cut through the reinforced walls of the mining tunnels without slowing down. They moved fast, and they moved in coordinated units, and they were very, very good at what they did. The Vorkai military was not built on arrogance alone. They were genuinely capable. 2 centuries of empire had not made them soft. It had made them experienced, and experienced soldiers in large numbers were a serious problem no matter how good your plan was. The humans took losses, real ones, not the clean, distant kind that gets described in histories later as casualties and statistics. Real losses, with names and faces and people left behind to feel the weight of them. In the tunnels beneath Vetsora, Cole's group was cut off from the surface by a Vorkai sweep team that moved faster than expected. The corridor behind them collapsed under weapons fire, sealing off their exit route. 3 people from his group did not make it past that first collapse. He filed it somewhere deep and kept moving, because stopping to process things in the middle of a fight was a way to end up being processed yourself. He had 12 people with him when they reached the lower maintenance level. Nora Vance was among them, her left arm badly burned from a plasma discharge that had caught her when she pushed another worker out of the way. She did not complain about it. She kept moving and kept her burned arm close to her body, and focused on the next step the same way Cole had taught her to. One thing at a time, in order, until there were no more things. They were pinned. Above them, 6 levels up, was the eastern foundation of the Vorkai garrison. Cole could hear the movement of soldiers through the rock and steel, a low vibration that traveled through the floor and up through the soles of his boots. He had maybe 2 hours before the sweep teams worked their way down to this level. Maybe less. He looked at the equipment around him. It was a mining level. There were drill rigs, pressure charges used for breaking up deep rock formations, seismic stabilizers. Tools he had worked with for 3 decades. Tools he understood the way most people understand the rooms of the house they grew up in. He told the others what he was going to do. 2 of them looked at him like he had lost his mind. The rest of them started helping without a word, because 30 years of living underground either breaks a person or turns them into someone who solves problems with whatever is in front of them. And the people still standing in this tunnel were the second kind. It took Cole 6 hours to build what he needed. 6 hours of careful, quiet work, while Nora sat near the entrance with 2 others and listened for the sound of boots on stairs. His hands did not shake. He had no room in him for shaking. He thought only about measurements and angles and load distribution, the same focused thinking that had kept him alive and useful for 3 decades, now pointed at a single specific outcome. When it was done, he moved everyone to the far end of the lower level, behind 2 sets of reinforced blast doors. He checked that everyone was clear. Then he triggered the charge. The sound was not like an explosion. It was deeper than that. It was the sound of something fundamental giving way, a long, grinding crack that seemed to come from inside the earth itself, followed by a rolling concussion that knocked everyone off their feet, even through the blast doors. The floor shook for a long time. Dust came through every gap. Then, slowly, the shaking stopped. Cole stood up. He looked at the others, counted them, all 12, all upright. Where the eastern garrison had been, there was now a very large hole in the surface of Mars. 3 systems away, Dana Holm was dealing with a different kind of problem. The Vorkai had sent 3 warships to her colony, not 40, which told her they still did not fully understand what they were dealing with. They thought this was a local labor disruption that required firm correction, not a coordinated multi-world operation. She intended to let them keep thinking that for as long as possible. What she had were 3 converted ore haulers, massive, slow, built for pulling rock out of space and not for anything resembling combat. What she understood, because she had spent 15 years studying the gravitational patterns of the gas giant her colony orbited, was that the Vorkai helmsmen coming in to engage her were following standard military approach vectors. Standard military approach vectors were designed for open space. They were not designed for the complex gravitational interference generated by a gas giant with 17 active moons at close orbit. Dana got on the comm to her 3 hauler crews and gave them headings that looked, to anyone who did not know this particular stretch of space intimately, like they were running. The Vorkai ships accelerated to intercept. They followed the haulers directly into the gravitational corridor Dana had been studying for a decade and a half. The haulers, which knew exactly where they were going, pulled through clean. The Vorkai warships, moving fast and confident, hit the interference pattern at full speed and spent the next 40 minutes fighting to maintain any kind of stable orientation. During those 40 minutes, Dana's haulers came back around, using the same gravitational pull to accelerate beyond anything their engines could have managed in open space, and hit 2 of the 3 Vorkai ships with asteroid-cracking charges at close range. 2 destroyers went dark. The 3rd pulled back and did not return. Dana set down her headset and rubbed her eyes. She was not celebrating. Around her, the people who had been with her for years were looking at each other with an expression she recognized. The expression of people who had spent so long preparing for something that they had never quite believed would actually happen. And now it had, and they did not know exactly what feeling went with that. Dana knew what feeling went with it. She had known for a long time. It was not triumph. It was not joy. It was something quieter and more serious than either of those things. It was the feeling of a door opening that had been locked for 200 years, and the understanding that what mattered now was not the door, but what you chose to do once you walked through it. She stood up, straightened her coat, and told everyone to get back to work. There was still a great deal left to do. They called us slaves. We reduced their armies to ashes. 18 months after Dana Holm's broadcast, the guns had gone quiet. Not everywhere, not completely. There were still skirmishes at the edges of contested space, still Vorkai patrol ships that pushed boundaries and had to be pushed back, still human cells on distant worlds, fighting battles that the rest of the network had not yet been able to reach. The war, if it could be called that, had not ended, but it had changed shape. And the shape it had changed into was something the Dominion High Chamber had not publicly admitted to yet, even though everyone on both sides understood it clearly. The Vorkai had stopped advancing. For the first time in 400 years of empire, the Dominion had drawn a line and stepped back behind it. They did not announce this. There was no ceremony, no document signed in a formal hall. What happened instead was quieter and in many ways more significant. The Vorkai simply stopped sending fleets into the 7 worlds where the human resistance had taken hold. and started referring to those worlds in their internal communications using a new classification. The classification did not translate perfectly into any human language, but it meant something close to a region currently outside productive engagement, which was a very long way of saying they had decided, at least for now, that the cost was too high. 200 years of empire had taught the Vorkai many things. One of those things was when to stop spending resources on a problem that was costing more than it was returning. Humans, it turned out, had stopped being a resource and started being an expense. The math had changed. The Dominion understood math very well. Cole Hargrove stood on the surface of Mars and looked up at the sky. He had not stood on the surface in 31 years. The habitat dome above him was patched in 3 places, and the air recyclers were old and loud, and the whole structure had the feeling of something held together by determination more than engineering. But it was holding, and through the scratched and slightly clouded dome material above his head, he could see the Martian sky, that particular shade of pale orange that no amount of description ever quite captured accurately. He stood there for a long time without moving. He was not a man given to large emotional moments. His whole life had trained him away from them. But standing there, feeling the difference between the recycled tunnel air he had breathed for 3 decades and the recycled dome air he was breathing now, he felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a word for. It was not happiness exactly. It was bigger and older and more complicated than happiness. It was the feeling of a debt being partially repaid to people who were no longer alive to receive it. He thought about his father. He thought about the stone handed to him by Nora Vance in a dim tunnel what felt like a lifetime ago. He thought about the 3 people he had lost in the corridor collapse and the weight he had been carrying since then, which had not gotten lighter, but which he had gotten better at carrying. He made a list in his head, the same way he always dealt with things that mattered. Not a list of what had been lost, a list of what still needed doing. It was a long list. He felt better for having it. Lena Carr sat across a wide table from a Vorkai diplomatic envoy in a room that used to be an administrative office of the colonial government of Vethsora. The room had been stripped of its Vorkai furnishings and refitted plainly. A table, chairs, a window that looked out over the red surface of Mars. The envoy was younger than Lena expected, with the careful stillness of someone who had been briefed very thoroughly and was trying hard to show none of his discomfort. He was not entirely succeeding. Lena had been appointed to lead the first human diplomatic contact, which she found slightly amusing, since her entire career until recently had consisted of serving meals and pretending not to listen. She had decided that was actually the right background for this kind of work. Diplomacy, in her experience, was mostly about knowing when to speak and when to let the silence do its job. She was very good at silence. The envoy read from a prepared statement about the Dominion's position on the current situation, using careful language that avoided any word that could be interpreted as an acknowledgement of defeat. Lena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she told him in plain terms that the humans were not interested in returning to any arrangement resembling the previous one. That the 7 worlds currently under human control were going to stay that way, and that the most practical outcome for everyone was a clear and mutually respected boundary. She said this without raising her voice, or leaning forward, or doing any of the things people do when they are trying to seem powerful. She just said it, the way you say a thing that is already true. The envoy asked her, after a pause, how humans had managed to coordinate a resistance across 14 worlds for 2 centuries under total Vorkai surveillance. Lena looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You never asked our names." The envoy did not understand what she meant. She did not explain it. Some things were only understandable from the inside. He had taken the repaired medical frigate beyond the boundary of the 7 liberated worlds, and was making stops at 3 other occupied systems. worlds where other species lived under the same Vorkai administration that humanity had just cracked open. Species that were watching what had happened with a very particular kind of attention. The kind of attention that comes from recognizing something you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting for it. Owen did not arrive with weapons or soldiers or grand declarations. He arrived with medical supplies, technical knowledge, and a copy of the archive. Adapted, translated into 3 different languages with the help of 2 xenolinguists who had been part of the network. He sat with the people on those worlds, and he talked, and he listened, and he shared what humanity had spent 2 centuries collecting. He did not tell them what to do with it. That was not his place. He simply made sure they had it, because knowledge given freely was one of the few things that cost the giver nothing and gave the receiver everything. On a reclaimed street in what had once been a Vorkai-controlled district of Earth's northern continent, a child of about 8 years old sat in a building that used to process labor assignments and now processed students. A teacher stood at the front of the room, drawing a map of known space on the wall, a wide, sprawling thing full of systems and distances that took a long time to draw. The child watched it grow across the wall and then raised her hand and asked how many stars were out there. The teacher said, "Enough." The child asked, "Enough for what?" The teacher set down her marker and looked at the map for a moment. Then she looked at the child and said, "Enough for everyone who remembers what it cost to get here." Outside the window, the sky over Earth was blue. The deep, unreasonable, stubborn blue it had always been. The kind of blue that had no business being as beautiful as it was, given everything that had happened under it. But there it was anyway. And in the archive, copied into 1,000 minds, passed between hands on a dozen worlds, traveling outward now through space the way light travels, because nothing that moves at that speed can be recalled or contained, was everything humanity had ever learned about surviving things that should have killed it. It was, by any honest measure, quite a lot, and it was only the beginning.